This is Kathy Dykstra, and we are back here with our City Frock Sew-Along. So I've got all my various items here on the table, and I just wanted to show you what I've got going here. So I've got my pleated front of the dress, and I've marked the center and tied it off so that it's the correct size for the yoke. If you are doing a gathered yoke version, we can gather it up when we're at the sewing machine, but because I'm smocking, I've got this panel finished. Then I have my other pieces cut out, and I have already done all my different markings. I've got my center back, it's hard to see, but I've got my little dot marked on the center back. And I've got my side front, and I've also marked the pocket placement line on the side front. And then I've done the same thing with the lining pieces. This is the front lining, and I've got my pleat marked here. And on my back lining piece, again, I've got my little dot marked at the center. I do have my pockets cut out, and while this is a busy print, it is a one-way print, so I have marked this with an up arrow on both pocket pieces so that I get the fabric with the correct directional print. And all of the yardage information on the pattern pieces is for directional prints. So if you have a solid colored piece of fabric or something like a seersucker or line piqué, that it does not matter which way the direction of the pattern pieces go when you lay it out, you will be able to get by with a little bit less fabric than what is indicated on the pattern. So you may want to measure that out. And of course I've got my pocket band cut out of the contrast fabric. Then I also have my cutting board here and my rotary cutter, my piping, and I've cut all my strips for piping as well as for the lower band to finish the hem of the dress. I cut all of them out at one time, and I always cut my piping a little bit wider than it needs to be anyway, and then we'll use a piping ruler and my rotary cutter to trim it down to the correct size. I find that to be the most accurate way to do things. And then of course I've got my threads and extra bobbins. I've got two different pieces of Rickrack here. I'm not exactly sure which one I'm going to use. I'll decide that when I get the contrast on the pocket. I'll slip both of them under and decide which one I like better. And then I of course have my sewing machine needles. I'm going to be using the size 70 Microtex needle because this is just a lightweight seersucker and the lining is batiste. So I've got all this together. I'm going to go ahead and set up my sewing machine, and then we will begin sewing. And I am going to start by making all of the piping that I need. So I will first measure all of my pattern pieces because I will be piping around the neck, around the armholes, and then down the side front pieces. And whatever that measurement is, I want that much piping made. So I have my strips of bias, and I am ready to make piping. Now, I was using a 1 yard piece of fabric, so I have very long pieces of piping, and they don't need to be pieced together. However, if you have just the 1/3 yard of piping that was suggested with the pattern, you're going to need to piece your piping together. So for those that might be newer to this sort of thing, I'm going to show you how you piece. You don't want to cut a straight cut across here and put a straight seam with your piping, because if you do it that way, all of your piping has the bulk at that seam line on either side. So it is better to have a diagonal seam if I sew from the top here down to the bottom, I will end up with a diagonal seam, and that will distribute the bulk of the piping around the cording so it's not all in one spot. I have my machine set up with a 1.5 stitch length, and I will go ahead and piece together the different strips of bias until I have the length that's needed for the project. And then I like to just take one strip of bias, then I'll go ahead and get the next one ready. And you always match these on grain cuts so that you get a nice straight seam. After you have your seam sewn, you want to trim this seam allowance in half and then press it open. But you can see when you do that, that when it wraps around the piping, you've got a little bit of seam allowance on this side and a little bit of seam allowance on that side, as opposed to having all the bulk on either side in one place. To make your piping, you have a choice of what foot you prefer or like to use to make piping. I like to use my zipper foot. That's what I've done for as many years as I've been sewing, and so that is my preferred foot. But if you don't want to use that one, you can also use a 5-groove pin tuck foot, because the baby cording will fit nicely in that groove. You would just fold your piping over the cording and then have that ride in the groove. You'd need to bump your needle over to the left so that it doesn't hit the cording, but that's another good option for making piping. Or some people like to use this applique foot, and again, it's got this nice little groove in the center here, so you would have the cording riding down the center, and you would bump your needle over to the left so that it didn't hit the cording. So whichever foot you prefer to use, go ahead and get that on your machine and get all your piping made first. Once you have decided what foot you want to use and you've moved your needle over appropriately, you can go ahead and start making up your piping. I'm wrapping the bias band around the cording and more or less matching up my edges. I don't worry about that too much because I will be trimming it to the correct width afterwards. And then I go ahead and put my foot down. I do use a longer stitch length for this, like a 3.0, and you do not want to have your needle as close as possible to this piping or to the cording, because each time you apply the piping, you're going to get just a little bit closer. So go ahead and get your different piping pieces made, and then we can trim them up and you will be ready. You won't have that tedious job at the end or at each step as you sew. I find that to be much more efficient. As I mentioned before, I do cut my piping or my bias strips wider, and then we'll cut the piping down to size because I find I get a more accurate seam allowance that way. And for that, I like to use this Dar Piping Magic Ruler. And these seam allowances for this pattern are 3/8 of an inch, so I can use the 3/8 inch guide to cut the piping to the right side. So you'll just need your rotary cutter, a mat, and your piping ruler, and you can just slide this along. It goes pretty quickly. And once you get all your piping trimmed to size, you can set it aside, and then when you get ready to apply it to a certain area of the garment, it's all ready. You don't have to stop and make the piping, and I find that to be a very efficient way to sew. Okay, so I'm ready to start sewing now. I like to pull the instructions up on my iPad and follow along that way because as you get to various parts of the pattern, if you want to zoom in and get a better look at whatever it might be, that's a great option. Whereas if you printed it off, that's obviously not possible. But you can do it however you like it. If you printed it, follow your printed instructions. So we're going to start with putting gathering stitches on the top of the pocket. And as I mentioned earlier, I have my pockets marked so that I know what the top is for the pocket. If you're doing the tunic length, you will only need to gather the top. You won't need to do anything to the bottom. So I usually set my stitch length for gathering at about a 4.0. I'm using a lightweight seersucker type of fabric. It's more like a plissé. And you always want to adjust your gathering length stitches to the fabric that you're working with. So if I was gathering batiste, I would probably use a 3.0 or a 3.5 stitch length. Whereas if you're working with corduroy, if you were going to make this as a winter jumper, you might need to lengthen your gathering stitches to a 5 or even a 6. But for me, the 4 or 4.5 will work well. And I'm going to run the first row of stitches at 1/8 of an inch, and then the second row at about 3/8 of an inch. The next step is to stitch the band to the top of the pocket. And so what you're going to want to do is use the right side of your band fabric and pin it to the wrong side of the pocket. Now in my case, I'm using a Kona cotton, and it's identical on both sides, so it doesn't matter. But if you're using a polka dot or some other print where it's a definite print, you want the right side of the pocket band to go to the wrong side of the pocket fabric. And then you just pull your gathers up, and I typically will put a pin on each end and then just stretch it out until it fits properly. And once that's done, you can use your fingernail or use a pin or whatever and adjust the gathers so that it looks nice. Now, if you decide you want to make this and have a really super puffy pocket, you can always cut your pocket strips with longer length, and that will give you more of a puffy pocket look. But I like just a little bit of puff to my pocket, so I do it that way. And then you're going to stitch this with your 3/8 inch seam allowance. And again, if you decide you want to play with the gathers a little bit, you can still do that. After your pocket gets stitched, the pocket band gets stitched to the pocket, you can take out this lower row of gathering stitches. I like to have one of the rows of gathering stitches below the stitching line because I think it gives you prettier gathers on whatever it is you're gathering. So the next step is to press this up towards the seam allowance, and then I'm going to press this down so that the cut edge of the pocket band meets the cut edge of the top of the pocket here, and then you will fold it over yet one more time and stitch it down right next to the fold. but I'm going to have to change my thread and stuff for that. So I'm going to go ahead and get the other pocket band stitched on, and I'll get this pressed and I'll be back. Got my bands pressed. I press this one. I don't actually press that down until after I've stitched it on. But before I change out my thread, I want to go ahead and gather the bottom of this pocket. So I've pressed up my seam allowance there, and this is for the dress version, not the tunic version. I'm going to go ahead and get my gathering stitches at the lower edge of the pocket as well. So now it's time to audition my Rickrack trim to decide which one I might want to use. So I've pinned one under one of the pockets and another color under another pocket. Sometimes I find there's a clear winner, and other times it's really more personal preference. I've decided to use the lighter color Rickrack, mostly because I like the size of this one better than the other one. I did like the vibrant color of the emerald green, but I do like the size of these, particularly since this is a larger size garment. I'm doing the size 8 for my granddaughter. So to stitch this down, you can either use an open-toed foot or an edge stitching foot. An edge stitching foot will give you perfectly aligned stitches. So that's the one I'm going to use, and I'm going to use a stitch length of a 3 or a 3.5. And obviously I've changed to a matching color thread up here. Now, if you're not confident doing all this in one step, you can use glue base. You can glue base down your Rickrack and press that dry, and then fold your bias or your pocket band over the top. Or you could actually stitch this to the pocket band. I'm not going to do that. I've done enough of this that's not necessary, but that is certainly a way to keep everything nice and even, and I would highly recommend it if you're newer to sewing. So we're going to go ahead and get this stitched down, and I like to use my needle down option so that if I have to adjust, the needle will stay in the fabric and keep everything aligned and in place. So you can see by keeping this folded edge aligned with that little blade that runs down the center of the foot, you will end up with a perfectly top stitched or perfectly edge stitched piece of fabric, in this case the pocket band. You can also pin that down if that is more in your comfort zone. So here you can see how nice the edge stitching is by using that edge stitching foot. So that's a real benefit. If you don't have one of those, you might want to think about getting one. So go ahead and do that for both pocket pieces. The next step is to get these pockets onto the dress side pieces. And you can see I've got my pocket placement line marked here. I've got my cutting board underneath here so I don't pin through my tablecloth, because that would not be too cool. And you can see that this is a slightly curved line. That's not going to be a problem with the pocket. We're just going to go ahead and pin the pocket down on one end and then on the other end. And then I'm going to pull up the gathering stitches until it fits. If you don't like the look of gathers, which I do kind of like, but if you didn't like that, you could always put a little pleat down here as well. That would just give it a little bit more of a tailored look to the pocket. And then once you've got it gathered, go ahead and just try and distribute the gathers somewhat evenly along the bottom edge here. You don't want them all in one place all bunched up. But once you get it to more or less where you like the way it looks, then along this bottom edge here, you want to pin it to keep it on that line. And then when you stitch, you want to stitch as close to the folded edge here as possible, and then pull out the gathering stitches afterwards. Once the bottom is pinned, you can go ahead and pin the two sides, and I typically will first pin the inside. So you've got your armhole here, the inside that's towards the center of the dress. I'll pin that, and then I'll pin the outside. Another thing I will mention here is if you are sewing for a girl who might be particularly tall and lean, you may need to make, for instance, a size 6, but add extra length to it because she's tall. You might want to drop the pocket placement line down. So if you've added 2 inches to the length of your dress, you may want to drop this pocket line down 1.5 inches or maybe even the 2 inches. That'll be up to you. But if you decide you need to do that, your pocket band is going to need to be longer, so that because as you get down, this angle gets a little bit wider. So keep that in mind if you've needed to add length to your dress. And the same thing if you have somebody who's short and maybe a little bit stockier, and so you might need a size 6, but you might need it shortened to the length of a size 4. You may need to raise your pocket up just a little bit, and that would shorten the length of your pocket band. I am ready to stitch my pocket to the side panel pieces. I've put my edge stitching on to get a nice straight stitch against the fold of the fabric here, and I've got my needle down option on, and that will just keep, just like when we edge stitched at the upper pocket edge when putting that panel on the pocket, this will give you a perfectly aligned stitch along the pocket bottom. There, and now you can see how nicely stitched that is there. And after you get the other lower edge stitched on, I'll switch back to a regular foot and just baste the sides onto the pockets. Now we're ready to start assembling the dress. If you plan to use any kind of trim in your seam allowances, in the side seam here, which I really like the look of piping there, Rickrack would also be really cute, or you could do a combination of the Rickrack and the piping, and all of those would be really cute options. This is the time that you would want to apply the piping or the trim. And when you do that, particularly for piping, if you'll remember, we didn't get as close as we possibly could to the cording that's inside the piping. This time you're going to want to move your needle over one more click so that you can get it just a little bit closer again to the cording. I decided to go all out and add the Rickrack and the piping to the side, the dress side. When you're applying it to the dress, you want to make sure that you don't stretch out either your piping or the dress as you go around this slight curve, because both of them are on somewhat of a bias and you don't want to get that stretched out. So, and as you can see, I chose to baste this Rickrack to the piping just to make sure it would stay in place. It just makes it a little bit easier. You could also use glue and glue baste it, but then you'd have to wait for it to dry. So whatever works for you, but I just thought this is kind of fun. Give it a shot. Okay, so I have my piping and rickrack on both side pieces, and I just wanted to give you a good close-up of this. So the turquoise stitching line is from when I made the piping, and I didn't stitch it as close to the cording as possible. And you can see the white stitching line is my stitching line from when I just applied the piping. And when I go to stitch the next, the center front panel to this, I will either stitch right on top of that stitching line, or I'll get even one thread closer as I stitch. So I wanted to show you that while it was still visible, because you could still see that the white thread stitching line is closer. This second white stitching line is where I basted the rickrack to the piping. So the last piece that we need to take care of is piping the bodice of the dress. And again, this is going to be one thread closer. This is the, well, it's not the bodice, the top yoke piece, I guess. So you're going to go ahead and stitch that. Okay. And the next step here will be to press this seam allowance to the inside of the, so you've got your wrong sides together here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I will come back and we will apply it to the smocked piece or the gathered piece if you're using the gathered option. I am ready to attach the yoke to the lower front panel of the dress. And I do have a smocked piece here, so I have found the center two pleats of the smocking design and I marked it. I used red thread here because using a blue washout marker, it's pretty much the same shade of blue as this, and it would kind of get lost in the print. And I'm going to be making this as a ready to smock. You can go ahead and smock it first and then do this afterwards, but I tend to make most things as ready to smock. So I have my wash away tape. It's sticky on one side and not sticky on the other side. And I'm going to go ahead and apply this to the seam allowance of the piping here on the upper yoke piece. So you go ahead and apply that, give it a good finger press down so it's sticky, and then you want to peel off the paper portion of it. And I usually just get a pin so that, and I don't know if you can see that, but the shiny part, that's the tape, which will stick to the yoke. And I've got this tied off just right, so what I want to do is align the center with those center two pleats and then align the outside edge with the outside edge of this center front panel on both sides. And once you have it aligned and you like the way that the pleats are distributed, you can give it a good finger press. And you can see I've got my center front of the yoke marked with a pin here. So I think that looks pretty good. If you've already smocked it, you would be aligning your piping with your top row of smocking. Okay, so now you can flip this back, and then when I stitch the yoke to the smocked or the gathered panel, if you're doing a gathered one, you would just use this stitching line as a guide, and you would want to get one thread closer. Now what I did on one of my other dresses is it is gathered at the top, but then I ran some gathering stitches below and I stitched a little piece of ribbon across there. So that's a cute way of dropping the length of the yoke a little bit. You can add ribbon, you can add other trim, but that was just a fun thing to do. So I've got this stitched on, and I went ahead and serged it, so that seam allowance is finished. And before I go any further, I want to make sure that I remove the cording from the seam allowance here of the piping. So I'm going to pull out 3/8 of an inch and clip that off. And that way you don't have cording in the seam allowance. It will reduce the bulk there. So I'm going to do that on both sides of this, and then also at the shoulder, and I can even do the hem of those side panel pieces. So you pull that out and then you just ease that back in, and now I have no bulk here in either side seam. So I'm going to do the same thing here at the top edge where the shoulder seams will be. I'm going to pull that out, because especially with the rickrack and the piping and if you leave the cording in, that just gives you an awful lot of bulk up there. This concludes this session of the Smockalong. Be sure to come back for the next session when we finish working on the dress.